Well, Musk is someone who, who clearly would like to be a kind of Russian-style oligarch. It's not a country that necessarily wishes us well or wishes us success.
It gets increasingly difficult for 27 member states to agree on anything like this, like a complete overhaul.
Well, so one of the things the EU has failed to do is to offer people security.
Hello and welcome to Tell Me More, the first English-speaking talk of Germany's newsweekly Die ZEIT. Today we are in Washington to talk with Anne Applebaum about her new book, Autocracy Inc. And to give you a little trigger warning, this book might change the view of your world in a factual sense. But before we dive into it, Anne Applebaum, thanks very much for making time for this.
Thanks for letting me do it.
Absolutely. You need no long introduction. I'd just like to point out that you are an acclaimed journalist and historian. You've been covering the Soviet Union and Russia since the early 1990s. Your books won various prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize for Gulag, a history. There's also another honor that gets too little esteem in my view, and that is that you have been sanctioned in 2022 by Russia for, and I quote, promotion of the Russophobic campaign and support for the regime in Kiev. So special congrats on that one. So talking about your new book, Autocracy Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Rule the World. You will receive the Friedenspreis, the Peace Prize of the German book trade for this book on October 20th in Frankfurt. Tell us about Autocracy Inc. What is it?
The book describes a network. It's not an alliance. It's not an axis. It's a network of countries who do not share the same ideology. So we're talking about nationalist Russia, communist China, theocratic Iran, Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, North Korea, Azerbaijan, a range of other countries who work together opportunistically when it's in their interests, not as a single unit and not directed by some kind of secret room. It's not like in a James Bond movie. There's a place where they all meet and sit around and have goals, but simply as it suits them and when the opportunity presents itself. These are all regimes that are, despite their different ideology and different goals, they're all regimes that operate as autocracies. They don't have independent courts. They don't have independent media. They don't have checks and balances. The rulers, whether it's the ruling party or one leader, have no opposition, no break on their power. And for them, the greatest threat that they see in the world is precisely the people who use the language of rule of law, of rights, of human rights, of democracy. And the one thing that they have in common is they are happy to work together against the people who use that language, and of course that's us.
Right. So what they have in common is that they see democracy as a strategic threat to their regimes, to their riches.
In that sense, it's a war of ideas. They see it's not just democracy. It's not just about voting. It's about rights. It's about the rule of law. It's about transparency. It's about accountability. All of those things are threats to their form of absolute power. And of course, that's the language of their own opposition, whether it's the Navalny movement in Russia or whether it's the Iranian women's rights movement. But it's also the language that we use. And they seek to push back against it at home, and then increasingly they also do so around the world. They would like to act with impunity anywhere on the planet, just as they do at home.
That sounds like mafia bosses working together, or bosses of different mafia states working together. Would that be?
That's actually not a bad analogy. I chose the English title of the book, Autocracy Inc., because I was looking for what would explain this. And my idea was that it was like a big corporation, and then there were these different companies within it, and they each have their own business model, and they cooperate when it suits them. But actually, mafia is also not a bad analogy, particularly since some of these states really do function like mafia states, and they have mafia rules. There's no, as I said, no rule of law. Instead, there's rule by law, meaning that the law is what the person in charge says it is.
Right.
And so that's the element that they have in common.
Okay. You give us a lot of factual examples in your book, which I think is pretty interesting, and I singled some of them out. I'd just like to quote some examples for our viewers so that they know what we are talking about. You say Russia plays a special role in the autocratic network because a lot of the strings, they go back and forth into Russia. One example, Iran provides drones to Russia for its war on Ukraine. North Korea supplies ammunitions and rockets to Russia. African states, again, like Eritrea, Zimbabwe, or Mali, back Russia at the United Nations, provided with impunity, as you said. Then Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan help Russia evade sanctions by importing parts into Russia that can be used for military purposes, something that the West actually wanted to avoid. And India buys Russian gas, thereby financing the regime. This all appears very elaborated. How did this, develop? You said that we shouldn't imagine it like a James Bond movie where, the head mafia boss strokes a black cat and everybody agrees that something has to be done. But how does this work?
I think they simply began to see that they had things in common. I mean, for example, I think that the relationship between Russia and Iran is a financial relationship. So the Iranians are selling drones to the Russians for use in Ukraine. And it looks like the Russians are possibly advising the Iranians on their nuclear program. Mm-hmm. It looks like they are possibly supplying the Houthis. This is one of Iran's proxy organizations in the Middle East with anti-ship missiles. They look to help out one another in militarily, but of course also economically. In your list, actually, just now you left out China.
Sure. Yeah.
And the Chinese are very important providers of components and parts and sanctioned materials to Russia, and they do that, I think, largely on a commercial basis. In all of these countries, you have these quasi-state, quasi-private companies. The quasi-state private companies in one country invest in the same kinds of companies in another country. Those deals sometimes are done to help keep one another in power. Sometimes they're done for profit. Sometimes they're designed to extract resources. Mm-hmm. The Russians have a whole system of offering mercenaries to African dictatorships, and in exchange getting concessions for diamond mines or other kinds of resources. Mm-hmm. So they have financial relationships as well, and of course they also have they use one another's, they imitate one another's tactics. So everybody has trouble with their own dissident movements, mm-hmm. and so they watch how repression works in other places. The Chinese sell their surveillance technology. They learn from one another's efforts to put down crowd movements, demonstrations. The Russians are great experts in disinformation and the use of the internet. Others have copied them mm-hmm. in doing that too. So they've simply learned from one another because they face common problems.
Right. So would you say that those states, mafia states, autocracies, they made a very smart use of globalization in the past 20-odd years? I mean,
look, globalization is just a fact. I mean, so we use it, they use it. We had this naive idea, I think, in the 1990s that globalization would work only one way, that opening up the world would mean that we used to use the expression democracy would go from mm-hmm. west to east. Mm-hmm. And it really didn't occur to anybody that the autocracy or autocratic behaviors or autocratic ideas could also go, so to speak, from east to west. So globalization is just a neutral fact, and the spread of ideas is a neutral fact, and the spread of technology is a neutral fact, and and technology itself is neutral. It doesn't have politics, right. And so it's all to do with the way that it's used, and mm-hmm. the same mm-hmm. tactics and the same technologies can be used in different ways by different states.
Right. You just used the word naivety. Let us stick to this a little bit, because from the 1990s onwards, there was the widespread assumption that democracy would spread, naturally across the globe. it didn't, obviously. But at the same time, there was another assumption, which was that if democracies get closer together and, for instance, pool sovereignty, put their democratic power together like the EU had done, this would improve the political clout on the world stage. And I wanted to ask you if maybe this was also to a certain extent a wrong assumption, given how the EU works these days, and because we're seeing some weaknesses in the way the EU works. The euro rules, the common currency rules, they have never been adhered by all member states, which led to the euro crisis. We also saw that the borders weren't properly policed, which led to the migration crisis. We also saw that the common defense industry was never built, which has led to an ammunition crisis, and we can't help Ukraine now with grenades and the most basic stuff that the Ukraine needs to defend itself. So what I want to say is that the idea of pooling power, pooling democratic power, might this have weakened Europe in a way that we didn't anticipate?
So that's a complicated question because you've just bundled together several different things that have different causes. I mean, the cause of the lack of a European large-scale defense industry isn't European Union. The cause is the NATO security umbrella and the feeling that many European countries had over the last decades, really, that they weren't challenged by anybody militarily, so why should they have an arms industry? So that's the cause of that. I mean, the strange thing about the European Union is that it's a confederation rather than a federation. Forgive me for splitting hairs, but it hasn't. It actually one of the biggest problems is that it hasn't pooled its power enough. Mm-hmm. And so, in the areas where there is joint power, for example, in trade negotiations, actually the EU is a superpower. Mm-hmm. It's very strong, and the EU has an important voice on the world stage. And in the areas where it has not pooled its power and mm-hmm. where there isn't cooperation in foreign policy, for example, the EU is very weak and is effectively led by the 2 or 3 or 4 large countries that want to have foreign policies. Not all of them do. And so it seems to me that the turning point is for Europe to make a decision about how it wants to operate on the world stage. I mean, it hasn't. We haven't. There's an evolution that hasn't been finished.
Mm-hmm. The reason why I'm asking this, of course, is that there is a widespread anger with the delivery of democracies in Europe these days. The anger goes like, why haven't you done enough about illegal immigration? Don't we need a complete overhaul of the immigration system?
So you probably do need a complete overhaul of the immigration system, but I'm not sure that's the EU's fault. Yep. Just make sure you're blaming the right thing.
No, I'm not blaming it. I'm just trying to find the root causes for weaknesses in our democracies. And one of the root causes might be that it gets increasingly difficult for 27 member states to agree on anything like this, like a complete overhaul. So while we thought we would gain political clout with pooling and sharing competences, there might be policy areas which, especially enrage the populist parties, where the EU should actually find better consensus and a more forceful consensus. And this is exactly what has not happened. And the populists, they feed on this anger.
Well, so one of the things the EU has failed to do is to offer people security. So there's a longer conversation to have. It's really the subject of my previous book about what it is that makes people nowadays feel insecure. So really we're living in a moment of enormous just revolutionary change, economic change, demographic change, social change in the nature of information. Whenever you have periods in history where you have that kind of change, you have reaction. You have people say, there's too much noise, I want it to stop. I want one leader, I don't want all this conflict. I want some kind of security. And there are people who nowadays feel, I grew up in a completely different world, and the world that I grew up in, the world of my childhood in, wherever, rural Germany or southeastern Poland or this, southeastern France, that world has disappeared, and they're not wrong. Worlds have disappeared and have changed, and it's very incumbent on democratic governments to give people a sense of security that despite all this change, there are elements of stability. And this, I think, is something that that most democracies have failed to do. And that's, and it is, if the EU presented itself as the guardian of the border, if the EU, or perhaps this is more appropriate for NATO, the EU and NATO together presented themselves as having a common face both against terrorism and against the possibility of Russian invasion. If people had faith that the EU was going to do those things, it would have a lot more legitimacy and power. But of course, these are also competences of national governments, and different national governments have dealt with this in different ways.
Sure. Tell us a little bit about how foreign powers exploit the frictions that emerge because of these weaknesses in democracy. We've seen a couple of examples in the past 10 years. We've seen Brexit. We have seen the emergence of the AfD in Germany. How would you describe, how do autocracies or Autocracy Inc. try to exploit these frictions and these new movements?
So to be clear, starting with Russia, because this is really their area of expertise, although now the Chinese and Venezuelans and others are involved in this too, for more than a decade, the Russians have systematically sought to use both money and influence in politics as well as propaganda to divide pretty much every democracy in the world. They do so by empowering both the far right and the far left. They do so by exploiting conflicts and differences. The Russians supported the Catalan separatist movement in Spain. I think they played a minor role in the Brexit debate, but they did play a role. They sought to amplify arguments in favor of Britain leaving the EU, as I don't think in that case it was decisive. And of course, they've been playing a role in Germany for many, many years. I told you just before we started this conversation, in 2017, I was part of an academic project that studied the Russian influence in the Bundestag election of that year. And we looked at the far left, we looked at the far right, we looked at, which was then the AfD and the beginnings of the AfD, and we looked at the Russian community in Germany. Right. And we looked, and we found a huge, very easy to spot patterns of influence. We worked with people who can analyze. At that time, it was Twitter and Facebook. Now it's moved on. And we found, you could see the patterns, you could see what they were doing in different places. And after the election, we wrote a report, which we took to Berlin. We presented at a think tank. I think we tried to take it to the chancellor's office, and we just couldn't find anybody who was interested. I mean, it was considered so obscure and sort of kind of conspiratorial. Our German democracy is so strong that there are no outsiders who can have any influence. But I mean, the narratives that the Russians have been building jointly together with the German far right have been a product of really 10 years of work. And just to sum it up, I mean, the autocratic world essentially, and there are a lot of different versions of this, has a narrative about democracy being weak and divided and degenerate, meaning sexually degenerate sometimes. The autocratic world being stable and safe and secure. And they then they report on incidents, or they describe stories that are designed to fit into this narrative, and they build on them in different forms of media. And this is something they've been doing pretty successfully and consistently, as I said, for many years. Right. And it's been of no interest to the mainstream German political parties until maybe recently, or even much to the German media. But I should say, it's not. I don't want to single out Germany. So we're speaking only really a couple of weeks after the FBI revealed really large payments of hundreds of thousands of dollars to far-right YouTubers and influencers in the United States, quite well-known people, there was RT, which is the Russian state media, was paying them to produce videos, including videos about the Ukraine war, but also videos about U.S. domestic politics. So they will fund anybody who undermines the democratic consensus, anybody who creates division. That's been their policy for a very long time.
Right. I mean, and the concrete result of this is that, for instance, in America, we have seen people shouting, Russia is our rescue. Or in Germany, we've seen people, carrying placards saying, Putin, help us.
But that's a result of 10 years of consistent propaganda, of political political funding, sometimes very small amounts of money, but sometimes just influence campaigns. So you also sometimes using the business community. I mean, this has been a long-term project.
Right. Speaking about Germany, there might be another factor playing into this when we talk about Eastern Germany in particular. It appears to me that the Eastern Germans, or many of them, they simply never made peace with the Westbindung, with Germany being firmly embedded in Western institutions, being a staunch ally of the US, and so on. And this very idea of Westbindung was contested in 45 and afterwards. So do you think it might also play a role that, one of the, let's say, default settings of the German democracy was that we have Westbindung, and the Eastern Germans, they were never asked if they were comfortable with this?
So I'm not the right person to analyze East Germany. I'm not. I don't live there, but instinctively, I would guess that the bigger problem is the one I've discussed already. East Germans have lived through an unbelievable number of changes. And don't necessarily see a secure future. They've again, demographic, social, all kinds of changes, and it would be the lack of confidence in the state and in the system that I think would make them susceptible more than any particular political idea. That would be my guess. I only know that because I was always being told that Poland was we had a successful far right government in Poland, and that was something to do with Poland being a former communist society, and it really wasn't. It was more a reflection of contemporary psychology.
Okay, but that's an interesting comparison there, because I think the far right in Poland, as far as I know, they were never pro-Putin, right?
No.
So how do you explain this difference? I mean, the Polish people, they have gone through a lot of change as well, and lost their past, build another future, build a democratic future, but they don't seem to be as susceptible to Russian propaganda as the Eastern Germans.
So the far right in Poland comes out, like the center right in Poland. Actually, they all come out of the anti-communist movement. So all the leaders were people who were leaders in the past, and I think that's that's a piece of the story. And I think they're also reflecting very real fear of Russia in Poland, which maybe you don't have in East Germany to the same extent. I mean, there was a tradition of talking about the Soviet Union as our friends, right? There was I've even read it in archival documents. The Stasi would talk about the KGB as die Freunde. That was the language that was used.
Yeah. Sticking to Germany for one more minute, if you allow, because you will be traveling to Germany soon. I do, of course, wonder what you will have to tell the Germans in your Friedenspreis speech. But Germany plays quite a role in your book, also because maybe of a certain form of naivety. I mean, even after Putin invaded Ukraine for the first time back in 2014, the German government clung to the idea of the Nord Stream pipeline, even if when it was clear that Putin had embarked on a form of neo-imperialism. So, judging from today with the benefit of hindsight, what have we Germans missed?
So let me answer that in a surprising way. To say, first of all, I understand why the Germans thought the way they did. and there was some justification for it. So the German national experience after 1945 was one of, that economic trade and relationships leads to peace and leads to harmony and creates prosperity. So that was literally the experience. And the German experience
within Europe.
Within Europe. And the German experience, even of the Cold War, your memory of the Cold War is that the Cold War came to an end thanks to Ostpolitik. That you had this good relations with East Germany, more or less, or you had this, there was an economic relationship via the pipelines with the Soviet Union. That prevented war, and that's why you got the end of the wall fell. That's not how Americans remember it.
Yeah.
We remember that our soldiers were there, and there was and there was
NATO deterrence.
There was NATO deterrence, and that's why we think that the Cold War ended. So there's a difference in memory. And the Poles think that the Cold War ended because of civic movements and solidarity.
And the Germans felt some historic guilt, obviously, also towards Russia.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe that's a piece of the story as well. So I understand where it came from, and I even in the 1990s there was a moment when the Russians thought that too. So the Russians, the people who were leading Russia in the 90s, believed that through trading with Germany and through trading with Europe and the world, that they would become more democratic and more liberal, and that they would be. And that it would be good for Russia to be integrated.
You're thinking of Yeltsin.
Yeltsin, but even very early Putin also, he used that language as well. He thought it was going to, at least it would enrich Russia to be open to the world. But there was a moment when this changed, and when it became clear that there was a crackdown happening in Russia, that Putin was undermining it. So it begins pretty early, actually, in the first decade of this century. And it became clear that the Russian state was becoming codependent on Western financial institutions, building and creating a kleptocracy, using our banks to launder money. There's the famous example of the state stealing an oil company from Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Yes. Renaming it and rebranding it, and then floating it on the London Stock Exchange, a stolen company. So they were a kind of hybrid state that was, on the one hand, accepted in the banks of the world, and on the other hand was acting unlawfully and illegally at home. And we tolerated that for a long time, and we didn't draw conclusions from it.
Right.
And so that was. Then there were other warning signs.
Facilitated it.
We facilitated it. We made money out of it. There were other warning signs. There were threats to Estonia early on. There were threats. There was the invasion of Georgia. Then there was the
Munich speech of Putin.
There was Munich speech, other speeches, and then there was the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And the specific case of Nord Stream 2, is that it's not a pipeline that needed to be built. The reason why it was built was for political reasons, because it enabled Russia to avoid Poland and Ukraine.
Right.
It wasn't needed in terms of volume or in terms of, And so when Chancellor Merkel agreed to continue building it after 2014, Putin understood that as, okay, we're going back to business as usual. The West talks a lot about democracy and rule of law, but actually we can invade Crimea and we're going to go back to doing what we were doing before. And that was so I feel like I don't want to blame everybody in 1991, but as time went on, it became more and more unforgivable not to understand what kind of state Russia was.
So you would say first we were victims of our optimism, and then we were victims of our naivety,
and at some point greed.
Yeah.
I mean, that people were making a lot of money from, not just from Nord Stream, but from Russian business more broadly. And, there was also this idea that I think is finally beginning to die, which is that you can have an economic sphere that is apolitical. We, big companies, we can just trade with other companies, and that doesn't have any political consequences. And I think people are beginning to understand that it can have consequences. And this is, of course, just as true in the trade with China.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. I mean, one would have thought that we have learned our lessons from our over-dependence on Russia economically. But obviously we are making the same mistake, or have been making the same mistake with China now. I mean, we wouldn't be able to build electric vehicles without batteries from China. I think 80% of the solar panels that we need for our green energy transition come from China, not to speak of lithium, other raw materials that get finished there. So are we falling into the same trap again, becoming over-dependent on an autocracy?
We could be. I think this expression de-risking in our trade with China is one that's, I think Ursula von der Leyen has used it, but others have used it as well, is one that's worth adopting. Whatever supply chains we have, whatever businesses we have, we must make sure that they're not overly dependent on China, which is a country that could, again, for political reasons, decide to cut us off or decide to change the price, or it's not a country that necessarily wishes us well or wishes us success, and I think that's important to understand in trade. I think business is beginning to understand this already. There's been a drop-off in foreign investment into China.
But isn't it too late for this? I mean, reading your book, one gets the impression that China has been building an empire for quite some time, securing raw materials in Africa, securing sea straits towards China, making sure that basically everything you need for a modern industrial society is being manufactured and delivered within their trading network. So
well, first of all, it's never too late. It's never too late for anything. There's no arc of history. There's no historical determinism. There's no rule that says China wins and we lose, or autocracy wins and democracy loses. What happens tomorrow is completely dependent on what we do today, and we can change course. In fact, we have already begun to change course.
And how far have we changed course?
Certainly in this country, the shift in attitude towards China and Chinese investment is already quite notable and clear. The understanding that, for example, that there are certain kinds of components and chips and electronics need to be made in this country. Yeah. That's already happened. That was one of the Biden administration's priorities. And so there's beginning to be a shift.
It is actually a silent trade war already, isn't it?
There's a silent trade war already. And as I said, businesses themselves are now deciding it might be better not to invest there.
Yeah. But who's the mightier part here, if you look at it, in this trade war?
Well, I mean, numerically, the democratic world is still larger and more prosperous in our economy. If you put together the American economy and the European economy, we're still the largest economies. So we still have a lot. We still have a lot of power if we want to use it.
Right. Let's jump to the possible countermeasures against Autocracy Inc. And I want to allude to the last chapter of your book here, which I found quite impressive. And in it, you describe how freedom activists and opposition leaders from around the world meet in Vilnius at a summit. And you were there. So it was a gathering of, let's say, oppressed idealists from Venezuela to Russia. And the one impression that one gets from this chapter is that, while democracies have their alliances, Democrats, like these people, don't. They don't have, a network or a formal alliance like NATO. NATO is an alliance of states, just like the EU, just like the G7. So do you see a kind of network of Democrats, not democracies, a network of Democrats building up around the globe?
It is building. I mean, what they impressed me with and what I learned from them is that what we need now is not really the old-fashioned kind of international institutions. Like, I don't want there to be an alliance of Democrats that has a building, in New York or Geneva and an annual conference, like we've just had the UN General Assembly. What you need are coalitions to deal with particular problems. And this you could do a coalition with the democratic states, with the democratic oppositions from from Russia or China or Venezuela. You could pull people together who have knowledge and interest, and you could focus on particular problems. And here, for example, the problem of kleptocracy. Anonymous companies, anonymously owned property, the offshore tax havens. These are things that we don't need for the normal functioning of our economies. And as a group of countries, you could begin to eliminate them, or you could make them harder to use, or you could make them more difficult. Okay. And so you could imagine a coalition in which you had Europeans, Americans, but also Asian and Latin American and African countries, perhaps. And you also had representatives from Russia who understand how it is that the Russian state is using our institutions. And you could build a program that way. That was really what my suggestion was. It wasn't. I don't imagine a kind of new UN.
Don't you imagine maybe kind of a global Solidarność movement of Democrats?
Yes, although it has to be more specific. Just saying, okay, we're all Democrats and we're all going to act together. I mean, so what? And it's there are problems to solve. And we should solve the problems. And a lot of the problems are internal. So I think, for example, the financial, the kleptocratic problem is partly internal. It's partly our it's to do with our own law and our own regulation. We can change it. The problem of the internet and the poor regulation of the internet and the way in which the advertising system on the internet favors outrage and anger. That's something we could also change. But you would need a coalition of countries and activists and people who understand the problem to change it. I'd rather see that rather than a kind of, democratic, a big room with lots of people sitting in it.
Right. But we haven't been very good, it seems. I mean, we the West, in supporting Democrats in those regimes in the past, have we?
We've done a little bit of it. Yeah. I mean, the coalition that was put together to help Ukraine was pretty remarkable. I mean, I didn't think it's completed the job, and I would argue that it could be more entrepreneurial, and we could have done many things faster and differently. But nevertheless, there wasn't an international coalition to arm Ukraine, and then there was. It was created basically by the Biden administration, but not only. It's a very important German contribution, Polish, Swedish,
Sure. But that's on the state level again. I was thinking about, actually supporting Democrats within autocratic states. Was Europe better there during the Cold War? Maybe because
so there are institutions that do it. In the U.S., we have something called the National Endowment for Democracy, which does this. There is a very small organization called the European Endowment for Democracy, which also does it. I mean, it's the German political parties do it a little bit through the Stiftungen, for the party foundations.
Who have now been kicked out of Russia.
You've been kicked out of Russia, I'm sure, but so has everybody. So have I. But there is some thinking that goes into that. But you're right. It could do with more thinking and more thought. It's problematic because it's not just about money. It's about what's the best way to help, how to amplify what they do, how to increase their impact, and how to think about messaging in Russia or in Venezuela or in Zimbabwe. Right. It's not just funding activists.
Right. We also thought, in the past, that people were naturally drawn towards democracy, towards the rule of law. Everybody wants to be treated with dignity and with respect. If you look at countries like China, for instance, where obviously a lot of people are just very happy with the state providing stability and wealth, would you still count on this, natural drive towards democracy, or have we been naive to this extent as well?
So this is the same problem we alluded to already, which is the belief that there is in English there's a phrase, the arc of history. The arc of history bends towards justice. That was a famous. It was a line Martin Luther King used. He actually got it from somebody else, and then Barack Obama used it. This idea that there's something inevitable about history, that the world will inevitably become democratic, this was wrong. I mean, this was and the inevitability gave us complacency. Because we didn't have to do anything in particular to make everybody democratic, then we didn't have to work on it. We didn't have to think about, for example, how should we be helping the Democrats in Russia? We weren't thinking about what are the consequences of trading with China? What are the political consequences of it? So because we just assumed everything would end well, and this was, this was of course a mistake. I mean, any idea about inevitability is wrong.
But do you still believe that the arc of history is bending towards?
No, I don't believe it. I mean, this is what I'm saying. There is no arc of history. I do think that in any society where there's a great deal of injustice, where people's rights are ignored, where people know that the law is unfair, where their leaders are very rich, they're millionaires or billionaires, and nobody knows why, and that describes quite a lot of modern dictators. I do think that people have an instinctive desire for justice and for rights. They don't always have a way to channel it or express it, or it's not always. They can be persuaded maybe to give up their rights in exchange for other things and so on. But it's in every autocratic society on the planet you find dissidents, you find opposition, you find people who very often it's people who become accidental opponents. An example of this is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. This is the leader of the Belarusian opposition. She was a housewife who was accidentally radicalized. Her husband was upset about some bureaucracy he was dealing with. He started a campaign to improve the Belarusian government. He was then arrested. She was allowed to run for president on the assumption that she was a housewife who didn't know anything. And then she, having had this experience of injustice and unfairness, she became leader of the opposition. And you can look around the world, you can find quite a lot of similar kinds of examples of apolitical people who are politicized by this experience of injustice. And so I would say that's where your hope is, not in some belief that history leads us one way or the other.
But these people might be a minority within those states.
Yes, they might be.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm asking you is if you think that the strategy of demonizing democracy, which the autocrats have applied, if this has been successful, broadly speaking, and that in a way we should bury our hopes that these states might become democracies in our lifetime in the next 50 years, and if we should look out for, other possibilities to contain them, maybe, or deter them.
So, I mean, one of the arguments in my book is about containment and deterrence. So, yes, I mean, the book is not an argument for invading China or imposing democracy on China. I don't believe that will happen. I would say that, this is a war of ideas, and liberal ideas do sometimes win. And so we also need to be conscious that we are engaged in this conflict, and that it's a conflict as though I don't want it to sound military. We're engaged in an international debate, and we should participate in it. Because ideas do spread and people do change and societies change. They become different. And so I think it's important to do that. At the same time, we should think in terms of military deterrence. We should think about being prepared. I mean, what's happening now in Russia, you have this enormous military buildup, partly with the help of Chinese components. I mean, there was actually a news story a couple of days ago about a Russian drone factory being built in China. Partly with the help of other autocracies, the Russians are beginning to build this huge arsenal. The Chinese also build an enormous number of weapons. The Iranians build a lot of weapons. Those weapons are being built, they're not being built for no reason. Yeah. And we need to be aware of that.
They have an advantage there over democracies, because these states, they can switch to war economy, which is not such an easy thing to do in a democracy.
They can't do it forever. I mean, there is a limit to the resources that even Russia has, and Russia's already running into trouble with labor shortages and other kinds of shortages. So, So it's not something they can do indefinitely. But you're right, they can do it temporarily. Remember, this is how the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. Was they, instead of building a prosperous economy, and instead of building a society that provided consumer goods makes it sound luxurious, but even supplying basic things to Russians, they put their money into building a military, and that
Stalin's industrial strategy only worked for so long.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And so so there's a limit to their ability to do it. But you're right. Certainly, in the short term, they can do it faster than we can.
Right. Anne Applebaum, being in the United States, we cannot help but talk about Donald Trump, who, of course, you also mentioned in your book. Do you think? Are you afraid that he might at least try to turn the United States into some form of autocracy?
So I think he might try. Which doesn't mean that he'll succeed, but he could create a lot of chaos and trouble in the meantime. What do I mean by that? He's not going to become a one-man dictator, or there won't be mass murder, and nothing like that. He could try to abuse the institutions of the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, the FBI. There are a lot of U.S. institutions that we've learned in the last few years whose role is defined as much by norms and habits and goodwill as by law. So, for example, there's a tradition in the U.S. that the Justice Department, most of the time, is not used specifically to prosecute the president's enemies, personal enemies.
Okay.
Trump could change that if he became president again. So there are ways in which he could bend and change and alter institutions. Of course, there would be an enormous amount of pushback, but he could try.
Could he do this within one presidency? But I guess in order to change institutions, you need to staff those institutions with loyalists.
Well, this is what he's proposing to do. I mean, this is exactly so. There have been both, discussions and also this famous think tank report called Project 2025 that was produced by the Heritage Foundation, which is close, interestingly, both to Trump and to Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, which is proposing exactly that. It's proposing to restaff institutions with loyalists, to remove civil servants, and to replace. I mean, this is, of course, exactly what Orban did in Hungary. It's actually what the Polish far right tried to do in Poland, which to some extent they succeeded, creating also a lot of chaos. But
so what you're saying is that the democracy in Hungary, the damaged democracy in Hungary, is a model for Trump?
Very much so. I don't know about Trump personally. I don't know that he understands what happened in Hungary, but certainly there are people around him who see that as a model, because Viktor Orban is in fact a classic kind of illiberal leader, in that he was democratically elected, absolutely legitimately Democrat. There's no question. There was no coup d'état. There was no tanks in the street. He won legitimately, and then as leader, he began to seek to weaken institutions, and that's. And really, this doesn't have to be a right-wing project. This is how Hugo Chavez destroyed the democracy of Venezuela. This is what Erdogan did in Turkey. Again, it's what the Law and Justice Party tried to do in Poland, didn't finish it, and eventually lost power. So this is nowadays. This is how democracies fall. To be clear, the illiberal world is still a little bit different from the world of the hard autocrats. I mean, Russia, China, and so on. But they have many things in common with it. And again, it's this scorn for checks and balances. It's the desire to dominate the information space. It's the attempt usually to take over the judiciary. Netanyahu tried this in Israel as well. I mean, so there's all of those. There's now a pattern, there's a playbook. When you have a democracy and you wish to undermine it, we know what are the institutions you try to control.
Right. In your book, you say that if he does that, if Trump does all that, he might combine this with a mass trolling campaign. You say that then the blending of autocratic and the democratic worlds will be complete. The mass trolling campaign, of course, reading this, Elon Musk springs to mind. what role could he play possibly?
Well, Musk is someone who, who clearly would like to be a kind of Russian-style oligarch. So somebody who has a intimate relationship with the state, which gives him, which will ensure that he remains rich, which gives him some role in dictating policy. I mean, he's said more or less something like this, and he seems to be also trying to use Twitter as a tool to spread far-right and pro-Trump ideas. So in that sense, he's, it's a little more. I want to be more nuanced. I mean, he didn't become rich that way. He became rich in a different way. He's not somebody who was made rich by the regime, which is how Russian oligarchs become rich. But he clearly is looking for some kind of hybrid model. Yeah.
Okay. So should we be prepared for this scenario when we talk about the regulation of social media? What can democracies do here to prevent being damaged?
Well, here's one of actually I have a lot of, the EU might be the only answer. So there are ways in which you could regulate social media, by which I do not mean censorship. You could open up algorithms, force companies to be more transparent about how they work, give people choice about algorithms. What would you like to see? What would you not like to see?
Exactly what the platforms don't want.
This is technologically possible, right? You could give people control over their data. You could change the way the ad tech market works, the advertising market works, right? Which is, this is not in my book, but I've learned more about it since writing it. You could give advertising companies more control over where their ads appear. Right now, they don't know. In effect, what happens now, some of what you see, the sort of outrage, anger, extremism that you see online, some of that is there because people want to spread it for political reasons, and some of it is there because you can make money by posting it. And we could eliminate that piece of the internet. It's a very hard subject. It's a little bit like kleptocracy. It's very complicated and technical. It's hard to raise to the level of public conversation. In the U.S., it's very controversial, and of course, in the U.S., the tech companies are very powerful. They have a lot of influence.
Right. So
this is why I'm hoping the EU is going to do it.
Right. I mean, as far as I see, the EU is not talking about algorithms so far. They are rather talking about harmful content. And
harmful content, I think, is a. I mean, I understand why they're talking about harmful content, but it's so difficult to define. I mean, you can.
And it can be perceived as censorship.
Exactly. And I mean, the other piece of the story, though, of course, is you can also say, the platforms have to obey the law, and they are responsible for the content that appears on their platforms. And if you did that,
which would make them publishers, which they deny they are.
Well, says who? What if legally they're? I mean, this was, by the way, this is an American legal decision not to treat them as publishers, but we could change that too. This is what some people also want to do.
Okay.
But I mean, if there were a bank that were helping to fund terrorism or was helping to fund child pornography, we would have no problem saying that the CEO of that bank should be held responsible.
Well, the boss of Telegram just got arrested because of this.
Well, I mean, if it was a different kind of institution, nobody would have found it remotely shocking.
Yeah, tricky field this.
Tricky, no, and it's a little bit out of the realm of my book, because changing the way the internet works is not just about international autocracy.
Right. And Applebaum, one final question, if I may. Of course, we're all curious to know, what are you about to tell the Germans in your Friedenspreis speech? You don't have to tell too much, but maybe just a glimpse.
I hope to talk a little bit about what peace really means. How do we have peace? When do we know we're at peace? And is peace the same thing as pacifism?
Or appeasement?
Or appeasement is something even more different. And how do we ensure that we maintain stability? And how maintaining peace might also require being vigilant.
Lovely. Thank you so much for your time.